Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me and when I'm going to share the framework for interactive storytelling that I developed during my research. So first of all, who am I? So I'm Miranda. I currently work as the narrative game lead at GeoAI Studios in Auckland. We're a small game studio that focuses on impact games, games for government. And here are a few just screenshots of stuff I've done on my own before starting at GeoAI and things at GeoAI. I come from a learning design background where I focused on making games for learning and making story-based learning. And that's how my interest started, which then developed into a late in life PhD research. For anyone in the room who's still thinking about it, like I was 56 when I got my PhD, so you can still do it. So come on, it doesn't move on. Oh. Yeah, so I'm not going to bore you with like the whole PhD. So it grew from that desire to make learning stories better. But what I'm talking about today is the part where I focused on learning from game narrative designers on how they work and get that best practice together, which is actually quite scattered over lots of different places, and to bring that together in a model that people can easily use. Just already a word of warning, it's going to be a lot of content, but happy for you to hit me up afterwards. I've also tried to make it very practical, because that was the intention of the research at the start. So, where is that best practice shared? I think we all know there's handbooks, but they're like the vision of quite big people in the industry, big handbooks. But in general, the nuggets of wisdom are shared at places like here. So conference talks, also industry publications like gamedeveloper.com, studio and personal blogs of game narrative designers, lots of interviews. There's now a lot of interviews actually that are from linear writing organizations that have game writers talk, podcasts. And so obviously I had to filter through like hundreds of these, and I focused on those texts that were texts in the wider sense, you know, from any media, that were really about the narrative, and also where practical tips were being shared. So not like high-level things, but like how to do things, processes, models, tools that people say, I always do this, or I use this personal little model. Obviously, written by game narrative designers and aimed at their peers and students, so not the handbooks for the wider public. Just as a quick share, this is the kind of game that mostly drives me. So, but I feel quite convinced that it's applicable to a lot of there's you know, obviously very word-driven games in here, but it focuses on how it works in a lot of games. So, let me present to you the interactive story avocado. So that's my model that came from reading all these things, and I'm going to go through it bit by bit. And it's both a procedure, you can follow it step by step, or you can start somewhere else, as you see by the arrows, somewhere in the middle, like I've got an amazing idea for a character, but this model shows you that everything else needs to fit around that and also work with the basics. So let's go through this step by step. I'm going to try and give you time for questions at the end, and at the same time not talk too fast and go through things too fast. So what I found in my sources is that there are two very high-level themes that everybody talked about. I called them the emotional drivers and player expressions. Things that always have to be there to pull your reader in, your player in. I'm going to start with the emotional driver. I'm going to give you quite a few quotes there as well. So we all know narrative has to be, you know, engaging and compelling, and we need emotion. So, but it's a big word. What do we actually mean by that? And Ryan Kaufman gave this great kind of example that showed to me what was meant by that. Like, we often think about the plot first, like this is going to happen in my story and It's just going on that higher level. What am I actually telling as a story here? And I think this is a room that all know Lord of the Rings, so it's quite nice to think about that, and it helps you with your own game and your own design to think about what is this almost universal theme that I'm appealing to my player with. And examples of universal themes can be things like family, relationships, things like guilt, loss, grief. Those are all things we can connect with. And it's really important to think of that higher level quite upfront, because that is going to influence everything in your narrative. It's going to be that underlying thought that helps you design all the bits and pieces, because if you don't, there's going to be jarring stuff. So what does that mean practically? So it's a foundational choice, as I said, that influences all other design elements. And you just think about, what do I want my player to feel in my game, in the narrative? And that even goes for games where you think there's not a narrative. Let me just put a big one. I like Tetris. Like, what's the narrative? There is a narrative. There's the player's narrative. What do we want them to feel? They want, you want them to feel a sense of solving the problem, of anxiety maybe even, or expectation of which block is going to come down next. So there's if you make a really narrative-based game, what do you want a player to feel? But also, if it's not, what's the player's journey emotionally? And that's really important. And that also immediately gives you the question, okay, and so how am I going to translate that to characters? So emotional driver, and then the player expression. Because obviously, it's a theme of this conference, the player, the human, at the end of the whole process of you making a game, they're the most important people. So you want to make your players feel that you pay attention to them, is that you're hearing them, you know they're there. And how do you do that? So when you make your game or your narrative, do you have spaces where a player can bring things of themselves into the game? Can they express an opinion, a preference, just a thought? So the screenshot I've got there is from Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. It's just a quick reflective question, which does not really influence the narrative, but it's like you feel pulled in, bringing your opinion to the table, and it connects you to the game. So also, do you give opportunities to relate to personal experiences? And so that's kind of linking those two things together, the emotional drivers and the player expression. It's like, do you give them the feeling immediately of linking somewhere with that emotion you're trying to evoke? How can players express themselves? One of the little techniques, and I know there's a lot of kind of bad rap about what we call fake choices, but actually fake choices can give you the opportunity to let a player express something of themselves. So if it doesn't really influence getting another ending, but just giving you the opportunity to express yourself on a very kind of basic level, if you need to go from A to B in a game, and you give people the opportunity to either go by a forest or by a bubbling river, and you give them a little bit of narrative in between, but it doesn't really matter. It still gives them an atmosphere of something that they preferred. So that's how you can use what many call a fake choice to good use. So it's can just affect your emotional perception, like the one we just saw about what do you think? Can you hate and love someone at the same time? So a game where I find that really well done is 80 Days. I love Inkle Studio games. There's lots and lots and lots of choices. I think the game in total is about 200,000 words, and you have choices all the time. So there's a little bit of uncertainty. Where is this going to go? You also never really know what's going to happen. So for people who haven't played it, you're trying to make your way around the world in 80 days. And there's lots and lots of opportunities to do that, lots of replayability. And so you get that balance between the emotion of curiosity, anxiety also of not really knowing what those choices mean. They're often just very little ones, you know. And at the same time, it becomes player expression, because everybody really has their own journey around the world because of all the possibilities, and it becomes the player expression to talk about it. Like, I went via Istanbul and then went to Vladivostok, and someone else said, like, well, I tried to go via Bangkok. And so it becomes a personal expression, how you talk about the game, and at the same time it's linked to that emotion. So the big themes. And then your first thing that you want to do is your high-level concept of the game. It's like determining what happens in the gameplay. What are your activities and resources and obstacles for the journey of the player? And here's one of my favorite tools, and I'm lucky to have the person in the room. This is the high concept formula. And it's a sentence that you can fill out. I actually love to kind of bring it into a table, so I have a little bit more space to think about what, why, and how happens in your game narrative. The way I like to use is to do an immediate expression of what I think it's going to do, and then bring it to a higher level, to that emotional driver, those themes that you're working on, and actually kind of detail it out more. So to give you an example what that looks like when you fill it out, I don't know if anyone has played Overboard, but this basically says what happens on a very, very high level. You're just talking to people, so you're actually a starlet in the 20s who's pushed her rich husband over the railing of the cruise ship. And so what you need to do is to make it to New York on that boat without being arrested. And so you have lots of little conversations, trying to evade answers, a lot of replayability in that game as well. But so it's a very, very high level. And you don't even go into the details of what I just told you of starlet, rich husband. It's just, what do you do here? One of the things that is really good to learn to work with this sentence is look at games that you played, and try to make that sentence for them, just to get into, before you make your own, just to play around with it and find out what you think a game is, and bring that to that higher level of the high-level conceptualization as well. So that's your very high level, and then obviously you saw the player, protagonist, you know, does activities to gain resources and so on. And obviously our characters are really, really important. So designing your protagonist and your NPCs is your next step, really links to that high-level conceptualization. And I think one of the most important things that brings that emotional driver in there is that we need to think of our characters as not a set of characteristics, but human beings with wants and needs and fears. And quite often it doesn't even matter what their characteristics are, because you're going to attain a certain goal. So as an example, I've got Alex in Oxenfree, also a game that I love. So you could describe her like literally what's here. I've called it age, ethnicities, backstories, shoe sizes. Actually, research shows that the way a person looks, or you're going to identify, but you identify much more with the emotional journey they're going through or the situation that they're in than any of those kind of outside or backstory elements. So what are they like really is what we need to design first to create a truly emotional and impactful narrative. So, because it's going to guide a lot of things. It's going to guide what Alex does. It's going to guide what Alex says. It's going to guide what other characters are going to say to her or not. So it's getting those traits out. How do they think, react, and feel in your game? Now, that's the most important description of your characters. And also not just do that for your protagonists, but also do that for your NPCs. Because they're all working towards the same goal in a sense, or they are antagonists, but they all fit within that same frame of what you're trying to achieve. So I'm giving you another example because not all protagonists in our games are, verbose characters with lots of dialogue and lots of dialogue to choose from. Even a little person like Princess Ida in Monument Valley, there's hardly any text in that game. But we get a feeling of who she is. And that's really important. We need to describe that for ourselves when we make our game, when we make our narrative. It's like Ida is tiny, she seems vulnerable, but she's also courageous because she's, trying to get past those enemies and choosing where to go and just going on to reach her goal. She's also really smart, but actually, obviously we are smart as the players, so we can turn all those steers to where they want to be. And she kind of cares about her goal, but she's also ruthless if she has to go for past enemies. So even a non-speaking character has those traits that you need to set out because they link to that player expression, they link to the emotion. So practical questions to ask yourself. Who is this protagonist? Who are the NPCs? Why do they feel the emotional driver you've been talking about? What is their purpose in the game? So obviously the protagonist, that's quite clear, but the NPCs, why are they there? Are you just putting them in there for a bit of world building? Are they, secondary, tertiary? And what are the traits that drive their actions, being choices and dialogue, which I'm going to talk about soon. So from that high-level conceptualization, you go down to, but now really talking about what's my story here. We're finally coming to the story. And quite a few of the experts that I studied said to make a list of all your scenes in the story. Because one of the most important things, and that's, obviously at a lower level already, but still high level, you're not writing out dialogue, it's just like making different scenes. Where does it begin? Where does it end? And can it move on to another scene? And what's the purpose of each scene? And it's a strong expression, but if it has no real purpose, then it shouldn't be there. And the purpose doesn't mean it leads me to the ending. The purpose of a scene can simply be to set a mood, to make a character's traits more clear to people. So, but if it has no purpose, it shouldn't be there. And that's where, as narrative designers, we need to be quite ruthless. Like, okay, this needs to be thrown out because it's not useful. And one of the things that you also, obviously we all work with interactive narrative, so you need to be quite comfortable with the fact that many of those scenes will never be seen by some players. So, and at the same time, they can be seen by players. So it's an interesting balance where that I think for The Walking Dead, they said that one of the paths only 5% of the players took. So it can be quite jarring, I think, if you know that you've written all that stuff and it only gets seen by 5%. But those 5% are important. So those scenes need to be good. They need to have purpose. They need to have narrative value. You only need to make sure that scenes that can be missed or skipped due to interactive do not carry any important information. I think that speaks for itself. So moving from scene to scene, there's a number of what Alexander calls dramatic forces over time that help you go from one to the other, what's happening. And those can be really big things, or they can be very small things. You know, it's like, imagine in your daily life, an invite that you think is boring can suddenly become a really interesting event once you're there, because you're meeting someone that you spent all evening talking to. An escalation, just things going a bit further, like a state goes into a bit of a higher state, and then things that change. So there's a few ways that scenes will go from one to the other. And so once you've written out those scenes with beginning, end, and purpose, it's also looking at how will they transition into other scenes. And that will also be quite clear in the choices. Am I setting the player up for going to a reversal of the situation, an escalation? It can help you write some choices as well. So, toolbox here. So you've got your scenes, your characters, and obviously from those characters, we've already talked about their traits, really important. It will determine how they talk. And dialogue, we all know, is something that we try to use for everything. It needs to do a lot in games. We're expecting it to be interesting for people to read, them feeling connected to what's being said, but also we love to shove information in there, you know, scene setting, introducing stuff, making kind of almost giving instructions on what to do next and what's the goal. So it needs to do a lot, so it's really, really hard to write. These are some of the issues that we see. The example that I give here is kind of brilliant, like explaining the whole goal of the game and the backstory in one big sentence. Like, yes, it's over and done with, you know, by using a dream of a main character. Other things is too formal, like not really listening to how people really talk, which is quite messy. There's this repetition, there's interruptions, there's, you know, bits and pieces, and definitely not fitting the character. So when you've designed your character with those traits, it should guide your dialogue, because it's quite jarring if there's a piece of dialogue there that you think, well, I didn't think that character would actually say that. And it can be quite easy to do that wrongly because we are so desperate to move some information in there or just move the story along. So yes, dialogue, absolutely not easy. So a number of tips here that I picked up from the experts is each character has a distinctive voice. Like even without voiceover, people should be able to identify who's talking. You know, we all know that when we look in our environment, we can kind of identify by the way a speech is done who's talking, because we know how people talk, how they tick. So, and ensure continuity in that voice and tone that you've chosen throughout. Even if you're trying to kind of shove some information in there, just make sure it would be something they say, or that it's spoken in the way they would say things. So dialogue choice is also an excellent space for self-expression for the player. So it can be one of those fake choices where you give them different ways to say something or different things to focus on in your sentence, and obviously still in that voice, but just like, how would I say this? What do I want to say first as a player? Just give them some space to choose what the protagonist says that links with themselves as well. And then obviously really, really important one, make less words do more work. And one of the big things that we do as humans is use subtext. we often know what someone wants to say without them really, really saying it. Subtext can do a lot of things. Subtext in dialogue can, for example, express someone's feeling of inferiority or superiority in the presence of another character. So you can establish a hierarchy, or a bit of rebellion or flippancy, like I don't think you're that important, by just the way that they say things. It's just that subtext is really, really important, but also really hard to do. But yeah, my advice is like, you know, eliminate words and eliminate again, because it's very possible to have less words that do more work with using subtext. So the last part of my model is choice design. Obviously, that's, you know, the big thing from Sid Meier, like a game is a range of interesting choices, which he claims he actually never said or he can't remember. It's quite interesting. But so I could basically talk 3 hours about choice design because there's so much there. So I'm going to go to some of the most important things. For me, this is the main thing. Obviously, it's really important what your player chooses, but it's much more important what you give them to choose from. So what we write, what we give them as choices, also in a non-written form, like what can they choose to do at that moment in the game, is going to frame their thinking. So choices exist of 3 things. We all know that. There's the framing, there's the options, and there are the outcomes of a choice. So we really need to think about what kind of information, so framing, does a player have to make the choice? And that's obviously the words that come immediately before or the situation that they're in, but there's also all the stuff they've already done. Like what kind of direction have they chosen? Which choices have they made before? How does that influence this particular specific choice you're working on now? How do they interplay? Also a longer story that I could tell you, but I did a test with writing the same choice in 5 different ways, and people changed their mind regularly on what they thought was the thing they wanted to do. With exactly the same information. I was just writing it as a dialogue, writing it as a description, giving the framing in the choices, outside of the choices. If you're interested, I'm happy to send that little test to you. So what do the choices represent for the character? So that's linked to your choice, your character design. Are these 3 or 4 things, whatever you're presenting, something that this character would do? Or is it against the emotional driver you've got going? Is it against the traits of that character? Is it something that you would not expect as the player to get as options? To kind of go back to that quote, what you offer as options is the most important thing, less than what they choose. Yeah, and as I said, how you offer them actually makes a difference, which is quite interesting from a psychology point of view. So some big things, like I started out as a learning designer, but I see this in games a lot as well. Choices are not multiple choice questions. It's not an exam. It's not an assessment. There shouldn't be like a very blatant right, wrong, gray. You're trying to push the player. I know we want to get them to a certain stage, but you need to forget about that. And that's what your point, the next point, I find this really, really important. One of the most important things is like each choice you craft is a moment. And you're the game designer, the narrative designer. You know where you want this story to go. You know where you want your player to end up. But your player doesn't. And they also shouldn't. So don't try to push them. Just think like, okay, at this point, what do they know? How is this moment actually interesting? Does it feel like a natural sequence of what we've been doing? And how does it make it an interesting choice space at that particular moment? And it's sometimes quite hard for us to kind of like flowchart, put it to the side for a moment. How do I feel if I don't know what's coming or I don't want to push them? Also, this is a bit me on my soapbox. Not everything needs to be what everybody calls a meaningful choice. Meaningful choices can be very small things, because meaningful can also be meaningful for how I feel as a player, how I feel I can express myself, how we set a certain mood, just advancing the story a bit, just mulling around in a space. I don't know if people have played Mutazione. That has a lot of space, so the writer calls it not multiple endings, but multiple middles. So you basically, the story will go on, but you have that space to kind of faff around, talk a bit more to a character, getting to know them better, ask them a bit more questions, talk about things if you want to do that. And it's that's giving that space for exploration, self-expression. And are they meaningful? Yes, but not in the way that a lot of people talk about meaningful, like this is important for the story of the game to go on. No, this is meaningful for your player, which is really important. Making each story path equally valuable kind of goes back to what I said before. Even if only 5% of your players will take this, the narrative value of that path needs to be equal. And one of the things that beginning interactive story designers tend to do is write the right path first and then go back to some of these decisions and write branching. And that links to that each choice as a unique moment as well. Because if you think about, okay, this is how I want them to go through it, or even 2 or 3 paths, and now I'm going to write other things. That's what in learning design we call distractors in multiple choice questions, because you're almost, when you're thinking that way and start that way, your mind goes to these extra options as secondary paths. And all of them are primary paths. There's a theory called narrative transportation theory, and that's, you know, when you're all immersed in a story, and that's where we want our players to be. And research proves that if you don't give them equal narrative value in those paths, that immersion gets broken. So you need to have that high quality narrative everywhere. Each thing as a full story that has its value. And then something that I find quite difficult to do is how do you make those choices feel unaltered? How do you try to make those feel organic for people? And there was a talk I saw at GDC a number of years ago, and Ryan Kaufman gave a really good example on how to narrow, what it means to narrow the choice space so that the 3 options, however there are, feel very unaltered, almost like they would naturally pop into people's minds. And I've got an example which he gave from, at that time, was working at the Hogwarts Mystery series. And I know Harry Potter is not the best example anymore, but everybody knows these people in the story, so it's an easy one to use. So if you've got a scene where Harry Potter meets Malfoy in the corridor of Hogwarts, and you give the choice to the player to either fight, flee, or make friends, there's a lot that's wanting there. It's like, why would he start fighting when he just meets them in the corridor? There's absolutely no reason. We know they're enemies, but at that point in time, you know, there's actually no reason to run away, to fight, or even make friends. So how can you make that choice space better? It's like a second iteration would be like, okay, so Malfoy comes up to Harry and says like, I want to fight a duel with you. In your background, you already know that that's not allowed at Hogwarts. So fighting and not fighting seems already more natural as a choice. Another thing would be like, it's not allowed here, so let's meet later in the grounds and have our duel, which is also not a good option, because what you're actually doing is delaying the choice of fight, don't fight to later. So it's just deferring that choice to another scene, and you almost have to write it again. So how can you make this even better? And the example that Ryan gave was like, what if he challenges him to a duel in front of a love interest? And that doesn't even have to be Harry, just in general in a game. So the stakes become higher. It's like, how do I want to look in front of this person I'm actually interested in? Do I want to be the peaceful one, walk away? Or do I want to show my strength and fight? And not, you know, it gives a space where you can frame a frame for those options that feels more natural. So that's narrowing the choice space. And obviously that happens throughout the whole narrative. You can work towards creating that choice space. Now, writing choices, as I said, really difficult thing. Something that really helps me is some of the models that I found that some narrative designers use to help them guide things. The yes, no, yes, but, no, and model gets used a lot also in role-playing games. It's like yes, you've succeeded, that was a fantastic choice, go on. No, everything completely goes to custard. But actually the more interesting options are yes, but, like, yeah, that was a good thing to do, but you've actually now called up another monster with that. So one's did, but your way of handling this was a problem. And no, and, like, you've chosen a really bad thing, and oh no, your monsters are now crawling everywhere because you've chosen a weapon that's going to spawn thousands of them. So if you can actually translate that to conversations as well. I really like to think of conversations as a little bit of like battles in a sense. And the accept, reject, deflect is also a really nice model that I love to use. Is in a conversation, you just go on with the same conversation, you answer, you continue what you were talking about. Rejecting is a negative reaction. I don't want to talk about this, or I have a different opinion. And then deflecting is just, I want to get out of this. Or I change the topic. So just little models to guide you a bit, because writing choices is really difficult. So again, everything together, kind of all works together, works for conversational scenes, work for games in general, works for big interactive narratives. And I try to also sell it to learning designers to make better learning. Yeah, so this is the interactive story avocado, and I have time for questions. Yay, I hope. This is my LinkedIn. Please connect, ask me lots of questions. I've also got my personal website with a link to my PhD thesis if you're very courageous. But also like a link to the sources that I used. Where I've found myself a bit of an archiving person, because in the 5 years that I worked on this, some of them are not online anymore, and luckily I PDF'd them from the web. Yeah, and some resources for you to look at. Okay, do we have time for questions? Yeah.
Hello. I feel like as writers, sometimes we have this idea of like these really poignant and loaded moments that we want to like convey like the depths of our feelings that we put on the page and stuff like that. And obviously this is all like, as you described, really shaped by the context of all these choices and things that we make. But when you're trying to say like pitch a storyline, either in like a work environment or like a pitch environment, things like that, how do you isolate the parts of your stories that you feel are going to resonate with people who want to like capture their interest? Like where do you go to find those moments that you want to share? How do you choose those?
That is in the emotional driver. Which emotions do you want your player to feel? If you have a very personal thing that you say, like, I really want these moments to resonate, it's really important to define upfront what those moments mean on a higher level, less on a plot level. So it's like that slide of like Lord of the Rings. What does it actually mean? You know, you can describe that journey, but what is it? How is it going to resonate with people? How do I make sure that what I feel comes over in my story?
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
The narrative part of the tools that you said at the very beginning, you have a reversal, a transformation, and a third one loss. Escalation.
Thank you. Escalation. The brain freeze, yeah.
Hi. Actually, I took a photo, so I'm just going to use that. You have a reversal, an escalation, and a transformation. It seems that just reading it at a superficial level, the first two will indicate a transformation of some sorts. But what would you identify as a difference between a reversal and a transformation?
A reversal is when it becomes something else. A transformation can just be a slight change that does not change the situation completely. It's just an extra element has come in that slightly changes the situation, or can change it in a big way, but can be something really small as well. Yeah, like when I said, you just go to an event, and it was a fun event, and to use that same metaphor that I used before, it's fun, but it becomes even more fun because you meet a friend that you haven't seen for ages. So it can be a transformation of just fun to really fun, which is, So it's just transforming what's already there. And escalation is just like heightening what it means to you. So yeah, there's a thin line. I think there was someone there before. Yeah, I think there was someone there put their hand up before. I don't want to make people unhappy.
So let's say you wanted to take like the interactive element to the extreme, and you wanted to actually create a system that, say, generated these sorts of narratives. What do you think would be like some of the major or even unforeseen challenges from a design perspective of creating such a system?
Yeah, I've played around with some kind of AI tools, for example, is mostly giving them some of those rules, like some of those choice models, for example. It's really helpful creating the right contexts, like putting lots of elements, stakes, stats around it that will guide the narrative in the right direction when it's generated. But yeah, giving your system solid human things to work with is what I would say. I don't know if that answers your question.
I guess maybe less from like a modern procedural, like generative AI perspective, but more like algorithmically.
Yeah, a few months ago we were at a conference in Brighton, and there was, I think it was something with Shadows, the game, and they built a dialogue system that would generate a lot of the narrative, but it had a lot of stuff around it. So lots of things that were like stats and which situation it was in. And if some of these things were even randomized, but that randomizing was driving the story. So it was a detective story where each time you went in, there were like different murders happening, but in the same atmosphere, but they had put such a massive system around it that they actually provide for free to just, drive that procedural generation of the situations and some of the text in there as well, with snippets as well that were in there.
Great, thank you.
Hey, I'm also doing a PhD in emotion in game design. I find it really interesting, and I'm curious if in your research you found much connections between the characters representing emotion and the emotion the players were feeling. Whether you found any insights throughout your research or not?
Yeah, so definitely those emotional drivers really need to resonate in your characters, because otherwise your people that play it are not going to feel it. And as I said, I'm happy to give you some things to read where it's clear that not the person themselves, but what they go through seems to be the link. It was something that wasn't related to games, but it was a student support in Australia, an Australian research, where they changed the stories that the trainers, that the facilitators actually saw to train them, where they linked in ethnicity and in age and so on. And it didn't really matter in their training. It mattered more what those people were going through. They could come from a completely different part of the world. If the story was the same of what they experienced, it linked much more than, for example, an Indian student advisor working with an Indian student. It didn't really matter that much as they taught. Yeah, so that was a really important one for me to see. There's a lot around compassion training as well that works around that topic of those universal themes that I was talking about also work in training. It's just picking up things that everybody knows how they feel, basically over all personalities and over the whole world.
Cool, thank you.
We'll have time for a few more questions. If you do have one, please raise your hand up high so we can all see.
Hello, thank you for the talk. In your opinion, what area in this field still needs more research? What are the current gaps in the academic field, in your opinion?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch
What, in your opinion, what area in this field still needs more research to be done?
Oh, there's still a lot of research to be done. So obviously going into more details of this, I've brought this to a higher level. Actually, my dream is to make some kind of website that looks like an advent calendar where you can open the doors of all these little bits and pieces and it goes to smaller stuff and all the resources. For example, I recently saw a talk that really went in quite deeply into how tertiary NPCs can work really well. So there's a lot of the detail and also how narrative design is much more than a story. It's just to really bring that to the world, like it influences everything. Narrative is also sound and we all know, and the art and everything, but to just, how do you link it all together and just not think about words all the time when you think of narrative. So, I think that's definitely a space, and then the details of specific things.
Hi. What are some of the best ways you think there exist to limit the infinite branching stories and endings? And you mentioned multiple middles. Is that like a concept of just having one ending, but everything comes back to that and resolving the branches before they get to the end?
I think it depends on what you're making, obviously. So in Mutazione, there's, for example, still different endings, but it's the aim of the game to build those relations with your characters, because that's what you want to do, and also influences your endings a bit. It's a difficult one. Obviously, you've got your production. You don't want 20 endings unless you have like unlimited money and lots of people. It's thinking of what's really important as endings, I think, which ones do matter a lot. I don't think it's resolving them somewhere in the middle. It really depends what you're making, what you're aiming for. I think that's a hard one to just put a line in. There is no line, I think.
Thank you so much, everyone. That's all the time we have for questions right now. Hope you enjoyed the talk. Please get up for Miranda.
Thank you.